session for Impaction's Skype session number 2. This particular article that we're talking about is from NextBillion, but like our previous session, I just want everyone to briefly introduce themselves. So I'll start with myself. I'm Shivani, co-founder of Impaction, and I'm getting my master's at GW in public policy. Sukanya, you want to go next?
Yeah. Hi everyone, I'm Sukanya, currently majoring in Human Resource and Labor Relations from New York Institute of Technology. Meg.
Hey everyone, I'm Meghna. I am the lead UX UI designer for Impaction, and I have another job, but I'm not graduating from anything right now.
Maribel, you want to go next?
Sure. Okay, my camera's working. Can you all see me? Okay.
Yeah.
So I'm Maribel, and I made up a name. I'm an interdisciplinarian. I'm an educator and a photographer. Recent graduate as well. So, and advocate for immigrants in the United States.
Cool. And Adam.
Hi, this is Adam. I live in Washington, D.C., and I'm currently an MBA student, and I'm also a human resource professional, and I'm passionate about providing quality education to youth around the world. Thank you.
Great. Thank you all for being here. So like I said, this article that we're going to be discussing today is from the NextBillion series, Course Correction, that discusses the author of this article, Philip Wilson, and his experience with working with his family's foundation, Familia de las Americas, and how they tried to tackle the challenge that comes with the lack of access to clean, safe water in his home country of Guatemala. So the author, Philip Wilson, he argues that in his experience, giving away products in the form of charity can actually be ineffective in recipient communities. In the past, the foundation, Familia de las Americas, gave away ceramic pot filters for free in poor communities in Guatemala. However, he found that the recipient communities did not use the filters and continued their traditional methods of boiling water as a means for effective water filtration. The author argues that instead, quote-unquote, poor communities should be treated as customers instead of charity, requiring them to pay for products, and in turn, they learn to value and use these services more effectively in their given communities. Consequently, Wilson founded Ecofiltro by selling a low-cost water filter to the poor. Wanting to keep the price point down for the poor, Wilson developed an urban filter model where Ecofiltro would sell higher price models to urban customers who could afford them, which in turn could support the sale of lower price models to poor communities. In the last 7 years, Ecofiltro has sold filters to over 250,000 rural communities and over 150,000 urban homes. This is an interesting model, and we're here to discuss different aspects of this particular piece. So yes, thank you for coming today, and let's move forward with the discussion. So I want to, how are general feelings, perceptions, ideas, thoughts about this particular article? What's everyone thinking?
So I can start unless someone else wants to. So I think the first thing that jumps to me or that I think about is the issue of water scarcity, water accessibility, and at the root of it, maybe the reasons why this is happening and how different individuals and actors in society are solving this problem differently. So I think of, climate change as well as social enterprises, thinking of ways to make sure that their end users are treated like customers with dignity. I also think about maybe the government's role in this, and big multinationals like Coca-Cola, and the help and or harm that they do in this area. So I think of the broader area, but diving deeply, there in this one case, this article does look specifically at a social enterprise and the positive impact and tremendous scale that it has been able to do.
I can go next. So adding on to what Maribel said, I think from a human psychology perspective, it's interesting how the author says that poor people are just like us. There shouldn't be any distinction. I think the value of money does play a key where if you buy something, you're more likely to take responsibility for it versus if you're given something, whether you want it or not, you may not necessarily use it. So I think it's just all about marketing and strategizing where showing the value of a filter versus just handing them away would really make the difference in treating the poor communities who may need the filters as customers. Probably one person bought it and talked about how useful it was or how helpful it was, and then it spread on through word of mouth or through utility, and increased other people to buy it at a lower cost. And also the design and kind of creating it to look cool probably helped as well. So I think it's also about the human psychology.
Yeah, jumping off of that point, Adam, I think that's what struck me really strongly. I really liked how very specifically the author mentioned they checked how much money people were spending on logs, and they figured out how much money from their monthly paycheck people were spending, and then they took that as a jump-off point to create the Ecofiltro. And they saw what the people wanted, and then they made sure they used the right technique to replace the technique they were using.
Yeah, I think going off of everyone's point, I thought it was, especially from the psychology position, associating value to a product by not providing it for free, even though it is essential, is very interesting. We think of water filtration as a basic human right, and as it should be. But in this given community, maybe it isn't representative of the world population, but in this given community, that strategy didn't work out as according to plan, even though the foundation's intentions were in the right place. And I thought that in the supply chain area, I thought that it was particularly interesting how Ecofiltro, Wilson's business on creating an affordable, low-cost water filter to poor communities. That business model in turn was very interesting because ultimately the recipient community in his mind were the poor communities in Guatemala. So he increased the cost for water filters in urban communities to make sure that the poor communities are able to get this basic human right. So that was a very interesting business model that is for-profit driven, but also very social impact driven, which you don't see that often.
I like the way how the person identify how much they're spending money to buy logs, to boil water, and the alternate way how they can use Ecofiltro to use water without any impurities. So I like his thought process and how he kept on persuading people by strengthening his facts and how it can be used by people living in rural areas. I feel it's a very innovative idea, and his target is that by 2020, all the people in Guatemala should have access to Ecofiltro, especially people living in the rural area. So, how we can use the facts that he had done to implement the product and the progression and the improvement that is already created on the people living in the rural areas, I believe he can achieve the target by 2020.
So I have a question for all of you. Sukanya, if you can please mute your video. Okay, thank you. So when it comes to changing perceptions, I think that this is a really difficult subject to talk about, especially when it comes to charity. There might be a separation, especially in developed and developing countries, about the need for charity and like the true altruistic motives that come from it. But when you read this article, did your perception of what charity actually means change at all?
I think it did a little bit for me. And I mentioned this very little before, but the aspect of dignity was brought in. And it was very interesting because, at least in my head, charity is just something nice you do for other people, and ultimately you don't necessarily see their side or how they perceive it or how they receive it. And just adding this aspect of, well, we want nice looking things too, and we want the dignity that comes with, paying whatever amount for these things was very interesting, and it was a completely different perspective for me. So it definitely gave me something to think about.
It kind of it added more perspective for me as well. I just wanted to share a personal example. Where I live, sometimes there are people that are homeless around, and they would come by and they would ask for money or they're asked for something, and I'm always very skeptical to give them money because I'm not sure what they're going to do with it. But one time I wanted to just give them a meal because he was saying, oh, can I get some money so I can get some food? And I was like, all right, let me take you into a store and have you buy some food. And then he started buying a whole bunch of things, more than I expected. And I said, well, this is how much I can afford right now. And he was being a little bit picky too. He's like, no, I want this, but I don't want this, and this doesn't look good. And it was just interesting because, and I mean, I wanted to let him enjoy his meal, so that was fine. But it was just interesting because maybe this was a rare opportunity for him as well. And it looked like, charity itself is about preference and about dignity, like Megna was saying. So that's interesting.
That is interesting, Adam. I actually have been in a similar situation, and I thought maybe it was just my demeanor that was encouraging that. And I personally did not know how to act in that situation, so I'm like, hey, do your thing, but I do have to run. So that's how I handled it, which introspectively was not a great way to handle it. It was, I don't know. I think now I'll have a different perspective on that.
Neither did I. I was a little bit confused too because you want to make sure you feel comfortable as well, and I wasn't necessarily feeling comfortable. But it was just interesting because I would like to do this more, but I would also want to make sure that I'm doing it for the right people, and it's not always easy to know who the right person is.
Exactly. That's a really good point.
Adam, I think your story definitely resonated with me as well. I've been in that situation a couple of times, and I'll be very honest here, and a little vulnerable that a part of me does get shocked when I hear this, because I grew up with the mentality that beggars aren't choosers. So if I'm asking for someone for help, and I put myself in that shoes, I've been in that situation, not that situation specifically, but situation where I needed something from someone. And they say, this is all I have. And I say, you know what? I'll take what you give me, and I'll make lemonade from the lemons you give me. So to get someone that in that time feels like, hey, you know, I'm at the store and I want X, Y, and Z, and then they'll maybe add some other things to it. It was a shock for me. But at the same time, you know, looking at it through your lens really adds a deep dimension to it. And also, you know, maybe ultimately is, you know, helping other people and helping everyone in society reach to the point where everyone can afford buying their own things, and how that happens in a society that's more and more you know, divided in terms of who can afford and who cannot. And I think that that's one of the bigger issues here that we may not need to discuss in depth, which is, you know, income disparity. But also, you know, the idea of who deserves to be helped and who doesn't. I've also felt that way. Like, should I give? Should I not give? What are they going to do with it? Are they going to harm themselves with it? And I don't want that to happen. So I think this opens up a really good discussion, which is can help harm. And this situation, you know, going back to this specific article, did help harm. I don't think it harmed. I think it helped in this situation. The organization, the company, got people filters that they needed and scaled that from 2,000 that their family's foundation could only reach, and now to 250,000. That's a huge jump. I think maybe in the long term, looking a little bit in the long term, can this harm or can this continue to help? Is looking at dependency in two ways. Yes, charity creates dependency and maybe it loses value, but are we opening the door for other companies to come in and abuse? Because this company is a trendsetter and they have a good moral compass, but do other people that come in with a for-profit, are they going to continue this trend of having a moral compass, or are they going to use it maybe as someone that already comes from wealth to take advantage of the poor and transfer the money from the poor to the rich, like has happened? So that, I think that's my long-term question. Will this continue to help, or will people become abusive? And do we have to have some kind of talk about, do social enterprises have to have some kind of restrictive profit that's in their legal documents? Or is that open for them to then become, you know, as profitable as possible? Just something to think about.
You actually brought a lot of. Oh, go ahead. Go ahead.
No, go ahead.
Yeah, thanks. You actually brought up a lot of interesting points, Maribel. And I am going to try to tackle a portion of it. But something that really spoke to me when you were talking to me was when you're giving vulnerable populations the freedom of choice, like, for instance, giving someone a $20 bill and they have the freedom to use it to whatever their capacity is, to whatever preferences they have. They aren't going to say that, no, I want you to guide me through a grocery store and tell me what to get. They will take that $20 bill and they will walk with it, and you don't know what's going to happen with that. But if, in Adam's example, if you actually tell them, okay, I'll walk with you to a store and you can choose the food that you want, you restrict that freedom of choice. And that person then walks through the store, and you understand that you are now seeing them as an actor that has an active voice as to what their preferences are and what they aren't. And it immediately shifts from charity to what I think is a customer, which I think this article particularly talks about. You're respecting that person's choice to an extent. I understand that, but you're understanding that this person has a mind, has an ability to think, and has interests and preferences of their own, and you are giving that person agency to choose. Granted, it's coming from your pocket, but you are still giving them the liberty to pick up foods that they desire. So it's really interesting seeing that shift, especially how it relates to the freedom of choice in this particular example.
Sorry to interrupt, but I didn't want to interrupt earlier. We only have 10 minutes left. FYI.
To add to all your points, I feel to help one another, you need empathy, and that empathy motivates yourself. And when you help another person, again, that person becomes more empathetic. Even though if he's from a very vulnerable background, with whatever little he's got, he tries to share with his friend or his family just to help them, which makes them more happy to see them helping their own people around them. So I believe, again, empathy and motivation plays a major role in this. And every person is empathetic, but how empathetic they are is based on their capacity to help other people around them. It can be by donation or by providing food or getting clothes. It's from their own perspective of what gives them happiness and satisfaction. I have a very quick question relating to this article. I would like all of you to give like an answer in 1 or 2 sentences, like how developing countries which are in a similar situation can adapt to such a model to reduce waterborne diseases for their growing population, and how can they educate those people in rural areas. It's a quick question for all of you, and anyone can come forward to answer it.
I think something that struck me about this article was the cultural dimension to it. The founder, for his name, of this company, he noticed that people were in this community in Guatemala were not liking the chlorine in their water. So I think it was his family or that had created the ceramic filter, which was a way that was culturally accepted. So this idea of, considering the end user's culture in finding a solution, I really admire. Many times, companies just go or foundations or even governments and have a solution for them and say, this is what you need to do now. But when it's culturally adapted, people are more likely to use it. So I think that is the first way to get to the solution and replicate this in other areas is what will people accept and what do they feel confident in. In this case with ceramic filters, in other case it can be collecting water, in other case it could be chlorine. So it really just depends on the culture, and listening to the end users with participatory approaches is, I think, crucial and very important, but it is time consuming. So that's all I have to say.
I'd like to add to Maribel. So, basically saying the same thing and talking about it in a business perspective. I don't have the technical knowledge, but this is all about customization and trying to get the user's needs. So, looking at culture would be one way, because it's all about we're not trying to put a square peg in a round hole. We want to make sure it fits. So I think that's really important. And the other part was that I think it's all about one way that you could have that cultural mindset is to have someone in upper management from that local area to make sure that they're represented and they're well heard and that their needs are met, so that people don't overlook them, especially if a business grows and starts to expand to different cultures and different areas. I want to make sure each part is equally represented.
Yeah. That's a great point. Actually, for me, I'm a user experience designer, so the way at least this problem was approached really spoke to me because, yeah, they made a few mistakes along the way and the way that their business model went. But then the way they corrected it is they went and talked to the people. They asked them what was going wrong. They asked them what would work better for them. And they took that knowledge and converted it into something more viable for them. So that really stood out for me.
Yeah, and I think like adding on to all of your points, listening is definitely number one. I'll just talk from like the international development perspective, but listening is definitely number one. And then number two, I think, is like if you're trying to form a path towards sustainability, especially with any new innovation device or idea or whatever it is, the people themselves, even after you've left, whatever your project is, the people themselves have to adapt the model. So what this means is like providing models like teacher of teacher, where like the people themselves come up in leadership positions and they learn to adopt these techniques in ways that empower other individuals in their communities to want to integrate this device, this idea, this project more in ways that provide a deeper meaning in that given community, to make sure that something like this is adopted over time. When it comes to techniques and ideas, the problem with having a new idea, no matter how trendy and great it sounds, is that a lot of the times they don't hit every single layer of the system. In order to create systemic change, you have to have the local community not only accept it, but are empowered to manage it themselves. So that is actually like one of the biggest things. And in order to do that, you have to listen to that population. If they don't feel that, if they don't accept it, then you haven't even hit the first layer. You aren't going to reach the systemic change. So I agree with all of you.
We are at 3 minutes.
Just a quick, not question, comment. I really like what Shivani said because Waves for Water is an organization that also provides filters, and they use that teacher training model, and they go into communities and sort of the community chooses a leader that will be in charge of replacing the filter. So I'm not sure in this case how the filtration works, whether it needs replacing, how often, but that did seem to work for them. So there are other people doing something very similar in other parts of the world, and I think that's also important. Other people in their own communities also coming up with their own social enterprises or foundations or something that will speak to their people's needs. And also economically, I think Suki is very interested in the economics of this. Going back to that was an important piece for them. They looked at how much the logs were that they were already using and said, we're going to charge you only 3 months of what you would pay for logs in 3 months, which means you're actually saving. It's a cost-saving strategy. So continuing a cost-saving strategy really, really would work in other areas because all you're doing is saying, where is your money going in terms of water, and how are we going to help you save? So it's flipping and framing that makes it very attractive to people.
Very true. I agree with that. Thanks, Marvel. I think we're going to be closing soon, but are there any last ideas, thoughts, anything you all want to throw out there before we close up for today?
Yeah. Sorry, go for it.
No, Megna, go ahead.
Now, I was just going to say, I feel like we hit all the major points in the article. We talked about the business idea. We talked about dignity versus charity, or dignity with charity. We talked about how this big change was made with all these little actions and by listening to the users. So it was just an overall, I thought, a really nicely wrapped up article. I think they touched on a lot of really important points, and we got to discuss those, so that's pretty great.
I think just one last thing. I know I speak too much, but the idea of a basic need being commodified and the implications of and the dangers of this, I think, are very important to consider. As much as I'm very excited that 250,000 people got help from this now, I'm also a bit worried about what happens in other parts of the world when a basic need starts to be commodified, and will people feel forced to buy water, and whatever that means, whether it's a bottled water, whether it's a filter, and the responsibility that we have to really consider this further in the future.
That's a really good point, because when it comes, this is the problem with the article that I think this gets to the crux of the problem, because at the end of the day, I mean, people are still paying for the logs to an extent, and they're using, I forgot the exact amount that the article said, how many logs that they're using, but at the end of the day, they're still paying to clean their water, essentially. And now there's this commodity that might be able to replace that, but when we're seeing climate change take more control over the world, we're going to see commodities like this pop up more and more in a way that may not create systemic change and may actually perpetuate the problem. And what's especially interesting and probably controversial about this article is that now we're seeing that it's kind of justifying the fact that basic human rights, like having access to water, should be attached to a price point. And I don't know if I completely agree with that. At the innovation lens, development lens, it's very interesting because it gets to the difference between, will people actually think that this is valuable if there's not money attached to it, versus this is a basic human right and everyone needs access to it. I don't know. And that's just very interesting. But I think that we have come to the close of the session.
Shivani, just to add to your point, in the article it said even people living in urban areas do buy the product. So even people living in the urban areas believe the water that they drink is not pure and it contains a lot of impurities. So water on a whole is a very valuable product, irrespective of whether you live in urban area or rural area. Still, that it contains impurities, and on an overall basis, you need products like Ecofiltro, irrespective of which part of the country you live in, to have access to a quality product like water, because it's a very basic essential for your life. So, understanding what pollutes the water and what contaminates the water is very important, I feel, before you design such kind of products to address the issues that are caused because of drinking contaminated water.
Yeah. I think that gets to the crux of the debate. And unfortunately, on that end, we do have to end. On that note, we do have to end the session. But all of you, thank you so much for joining us, and maybe we can even continue this discussion more in person. But thank you.